My talk will have some relation to the last question about what is left aside from market and oppressed, and might be the support for alternative possibilities. I'm thankful to organizers and happy to be here. First, because as Vadim talked, we are now facing this extremely impressive achievement of the High School of Economics, which I followed nearly from the beginning, you remember. Second, I'm very moved and excited to be here in this very place, which is one of the most famous intellectual and artistic place in Soviet and Russian history, and which I knew from performance, but also from cinema.
Какое бы новое сражение не покачнуло шар земной, я все равно паду на той единственной гражданской, и комиссары в пыльных шлемах склонятся молча надо мной. Я все равно паду на той единственной гражданской, и комиссары в пыльных шлемах склонятся молча надо мной.
Okay, so what? Sorry for the lack of transition. We'll go back to Soviet Union at the end. So what added value sociologists can bring to the monopoly of economists on value and monetary value, of course? More comprehensive approach to evaluation with the resulting development of a sociology of valuation and evaluation. And this is the trend which I belong to, with the former work about economies of worth and economy of convention, which had the strategy to locate evaluation within action in situation. And with the further extension that I will talk more today, because it's useful for my topic, the one regarding this regime of engagement with worlds and with others, which do not allow general equivalence, and which raise obstacles to commonality and the kind of equivalence which is brought to commonality. And the second extension is this transcultural comparison, which I try to develop through identifying structural grammars of commonality in the plural, which help to correct some bias of international categories in comparison. So the paper is about what could we say of the shifting of modes of and loci of evaluation in this transcultural perspective, specifically given the growing importance of governing through standards and objective, which reifies evaluation. I thought Mario would speak of another topic, which is more familiar to us. So I was introducing my talk with the discussion of this allegedly technical economist distinction between revealed preference and contingent evaluation, which are very important in the economist's evaluation of damages. And Marion mentioned the fact that in a comparison between US and France, in our sense and sensibility paper, that there is a very strong discrepancy because of the compromise between market worth and other worth in the US, much stronger than in France. But I want to point to the fact, which it doesn't develop, the fact that contingent evaluation is actually not only market, because it relies also on a survey test, asking the willingness to pay, but asking something like a vote to individuals, which is related, of course, to politics, to civic expression of political preferences, options. So that this contingent evaluation is something even stronger in this political liberal world, not only market world. But my point is another. This contingent evaluation is supposed to be developed escaping bias, and it's interesting. I quote Marion. She is quoting herself research. So I was fascinated by the fact that social scientists are supposed to prevent bias in this calculus of contingent evaluation. And the bias would be to take into account coastal communities, which are the most affected by these petrol catastrophes, and which should not have a different vote from American cities. And here we see very clearly that the alleged technical economist way of evaluation is strongly loaded with assumption about the good and assumption even about the construction of communities. Because in that case, these Alaskan communities are just disregarded. This makes the transition with my own first research about comparative study between US and France, which was published with the book with Michel Lamont. And as prescribed by Savior River handbooks, a Native American was associated with the protest in the US case. So we met her, and I was fascinated by the fact that she gave us not mythical narrative, but she introduced two very different scenes. The first one has nothing to do with culture, and this is an important point, because I don't want to limit the problem of oppression by this economist calculus to cultural or ethnic classical cultural definition. This is something that, by the way, Laura Centimeri developed a lot, specifically, and she presented her paper this morning, but you could read her paper. She has a very nice argument about uncommensurability. And uncommensurability is usually just taken as an issue of cultural, ethnic specificity. And I want to show that it's much stronger than that and much more somehow revealing the oppression by this calculus instrument. So the first scene is very typically oriented toward the public. This Miwok Native American shows us some kind of press book where the photos of the plants she collects have been taken by rangers, which mean very important people in the US nation, and revealing as proofs, because our sociology is very oriented towards probe, towards evidence, not only towards language. And so this press book demonstrated that the plants that she's so familiar with are valuable in a public evaluation in terms of biodiversity. Now, she said that it's not sufficient, that we should follow her. And that's interesting because, of course, that makes a completely different scene, which cannot be made public. We need to physically follow her in the place where she collects the plants. So the second scene is completely different. It is within pine forest and a very familiar surrounding for her. And she has her familiar engagement with this place, her clues, her cues, and she tries to make share it. This is her intention, and it fails. And it fails because we have no familiarity with her familiarity. And that shows that it's not, first, her valuation of this engagement with her familiar space is not less important than the first engagement in a public space. But of course, it raises very specific problem for politic and social life, because it's so difficult to make it common. Now, this is the reason why I developed this framework of regimes of engagement. And here I borrow the transparency from Laura. So what we've been studying with Luc Boltanski is relating to this public space of critique and justification. But now I want to show from the previous scenes the significance of the second scene, which is not made transferable in the lawsuit that Marion studied. This lawsuit disregarded both this Alaskan population damages, and more generally, this kind of very strong damage. The language of Bouteloup, I don't know whether you read her book, she studied that extensively in France, this terrible Amoko Cadiz, how would you call it in English? All spoil. Spill, sorry. And the vocabulary is that of rape. Now, just a moment, think of it. It's not just an image, a metaphor. Why do so many people speak of rape? As Claire Bouteloup mentioned very nicely, it is because this is an example of very intimate damage at this level of intimate corporal familiarity, which has been poorly, but which has been transferred in the public space and in the lawsuit space. So I think this is the reason why it is told also this way. So now I introduce very quickly the second tool, which is connected to the first, this regime of engagement, which is very important to this transcultural perspective that I want to stress. The idea that, and this is not something that we had in mind in unjustification research with Luc. The idea is to compare different, what I call grammar of commonality in the plural, among which the grammar of orders of worth is only one. The second one, you'll see later, you'll be relatively familiar with the second one, but not at all with the third one. And the third one is connecting, I would suggest, with the question by David Stark. But this will be the end of the talk. Now, two operations are to be done through this commonality building. First, what I call communicating, but don't think just of information communication. Think of the old meaning of making common with very various tools. This is something that is very important for our critical view of nowadays. How can we communicate not only with words? This is, of course, the example that I gave formerly with the Native American. Second, in that case of the first grammar, communication is through aggrandizement. You cannot communicate something which is not connected to a common good. So it's very demanding in terms of this aggrandizement. No? Is it okay? Aggrandizement. And this is the reason why this grammar of orders of worth is specific, and it's certainly not the theory of any social action at all, which is not something that we had in mind. Second, composing. Composing in terms of trying to take into account differences in something that will be made common. And this issue is very important. Which differences do you account for in this grammar? And this specifies each grammar. Now, I'm going to the second part, which is about a different requirement for commonality, which is actually the old tradition of political liberalism, not neoliberalism or market, political liberalism. And I based this part of my talk of a research by Emmanuel Chance, available in English, and some research also I've been doing of governing by standards, and now I would add governing by objectives. Because what is Emmanuel Chance working on is one of the last global, transnational, and I would say anti-etatic governing device. It's called multi-stakeholder roundtable. I don't know whether some of you are familiar with that. It's mainly developed around agro-environmental issues. And they are intended to get rid from failures of government and to build a device strongly informed by the liberal grammar where equal stakeholders are supposed to meet. And this, when you hear the list or read the list of this equal stakeholder, you can imagine that it's not an easy task, because you have these small growers, Indonesian plant growers, in the case of palm oil, which is the case studied by Chance, at one end, and at the other end, you have a very big multinational like Unilever, and they are supposed to have the same voice. This is the liberal grammar. Now, an additional element to the liberal grammar, which is not within the liberal grammar, is the fact that the output of this round table will not be politics in the classical terms, like in a liberal Senate. It will be standard setting. The output is standard. And the standards are supposed to be non-mandatory, but voluntary. So this is why it's a governing by standards. Now, an important thing to see is the fact that the basis, both for the liberal grammar and for this kind of device, is another regime of engagement, completely different from this familiar regime I mentioned first, and certainly different from this regime of justification relating to the common good. It's not just instrumental rational action. It is a relation, a capacity to project oneself in the future through a kind of project, a kind of plan. I use the term plan. Then, every intervention within this arena has to be based on this kind of engagement in a plan, which is supposed to be practical, realistic, effective, and where yourself, in terms of your will, your capacity of expressing yourself through a choice of an option available to all, this is very important. You cannot be selfish in terms of just speaking of something deeply emotional. Sorry, selfish. It's certain, selfish is the denunciation of this, so I shouldn't use this term. But you cannot deliver this kind of emotion that the Native American, and again, this is a faulty for me because I don't want to characterize her anymore as a Native American. But this person, as you and me, she was trying to share this emotional engagement with familiarity. You cannot do that in this arena because it's not in the format of a preferred option which will be available to all. Now, this format is deeply oppressive, as we can see in Emmanuel Chance's empirical research, on both other regimes, of engagement and their evaluation. let's see how the smallholders are disqualified during the process of the round table. Well, when they speak, they are disqualified from when they escape the regime of the plan, either by raising more political or common good issues, if you think of politics as the debate about conception of the common good. Then it's supposed to be like when they discuss the value sharing in the value chain, in terms of profit and on the other side, solidarity. Or when they discuss the domestic subjection of their position. Well, when they try to speak of that, well, it's said to be too abstract. This is interesting, too abstract. And it's disqualified. And secondly, it is disqualified also when they try to speak as the woman I mentioned before. Then they get too long, they get too emotional, and they are disqualified because they are said to be, I quote, too specific. And that's interesting because it's as if it was an issue of generality. And this is not an issue of generality because their concern of their daily life is extremely general as an issue. But it's not in the format acceptable for this engagement in a planned format acceptable for this round table. So now we get to the second grammar, where communicating assumes not to go to a specification of the common good. So it seems to be, and somehow it is less demanding, since you can speak through your interest. So interest is smaller than the common good. But as you've seen from what I said before, this format is actually very oppressive too, because it's preventing possible discussion of political critique regarding this conflicting notion of the common good, and also is disqualifying this level of familiar engagement. And composition in this grammar is precisely what we call negotiation. And personally, I am very reluctant to use negotiation, as sociologists do, as the very general category for putting things in common. Negotiation should be really connected and limited to this kind of grammar where it is the way to compose these different options. Now, my third part, which I would like to be a bit, and since I've been so fast, I will dedicate 2 minutes to the notion of engagement, because you've seen the transparency, but it's not just an issue of logic of action, or just type of action. My concern was deeper. It was the following. What kind of capacities of human being, very important for the maintaining of their personality, are to be dealt with and are sustained by some form of correspondence between themselves, between different moments of their life, of their self, which is what I call engaging, which is of course something related to this notion of engagement. But also looking at, this is what is also original, is in the category, looking at the support of the environment for this relative continuity of the person. So I'm looking for something that is usually ignored by theories of identity. Theories of identity in social science are not very sophisticated. You have either social, strong, permanent identity, or postmodern, hollow identity. Your identity is just narrative and what other people see of you. And this is not adequate for any kind of coordination. So it was also something that I intended to do, look for a tool that will help to have a more sophisticated view about personal identity and the dual problem of the basis of communality, which is also something based on promise, based of continuity. Okay, well, I didn't say much about, but anyway, it's small. Now, the third grammar is very important because it has been completely disregarded in a narrow conception of enlightenment. And now this narrow, and so this has connection with the previous talk. This very narrow conception, which is even getting more and more narrow with the economist notion of modernity that is prevailing nowadays. But even before the modernist conception of enlightenment, you can imagine that I'm not against enlightenment, this is not the issue. But the too narrow conception left aside a way of making communality which is very ordinary, which is not archaic, which has made archaic, which has been made archaic by this narrowness, but which is not archaic, and which I want to introduce now. And it is much more hospitable to this familiarity engagement, which I mentioned at the beginning. This engagement is very poorly accounted by economists. What is wrong? What? Oh no, it's not. Sorry. Routine, but routine is something very fixed, and engagement in familiarity is very dynamical. Or specific asset, which is something very interesting and very fruitful, of course, but which is just the way the world is offering gauges. And you remember that it is already the language by Williamson, hostages, for a kind of personal relation. Now, sociologists are much more clever for this kind of informal practices, but the problem is informal practice is a bit negative characterization, but apart from the name, there has been a very large sophisticated sociology, and especially in Russia, and I'm mentioning some of these people, and also the report by Myriam Desart about this debate here about informal. Now, theories of practice are partly missing the point. Why? Well, they are very interesting. I'm not going to ignore their support. But what they miss is the fact that practices at the level of familiarity are not collective. So that the problem for living in common, living together, is much more difficult than the one sociologists have in mind, when they begin the analysis with social practices, which are already made collective. Okay, here I mentioned my colleague research, François and Marc de Vernet, about the importance of this familiar convenience in the role of intermediaries in labor market. And I also mentioned the fact that the last advances in law against discrimination is actually in the need of going down to this level of familiarity. in terms of needed adaptation of the occupational situation to some sort of disability. Now I want to go to the grammar, which I call personal affinities to commonplaces. You'll see. It's not so mysterious. I mentioned before that the two previous grammar are really bad at making room for this familiar engagement. And because of that, I think that they are considered as archaic, although if you think of all these social network techniques that are so important and praised nowadays, well, of course there is a technique, but look at the way people make issues common. Well, they make issues common through deep personal investment of commonplace. Now, don't be mistaken. Commonplace, I use the term here, not at all as depreciative term. The depreciative term is the failure of communication through commonplace, and I use cliché because people use cliché too. Commonplace is not a cliché. And in this, we'll see later that. And in this social network, the commonplace, of course, are specifically related to either trendy things or it can be market goods. But the way they are used is very different from market. It is, again, through communication by very personal investment of these commonplaces, a film, a song. Now, the lack of taking into account of this familiar regime has as a consequence reaction that can be used by reactionary authoritarian regime, which is exactly what we observe nowadays in Europe and Western Europe as well. Okay, this is what I said before, the fact that, and this is in our empirical research, the way people use cliché to make clear in the test of communication that it failed. It failed because there was no personal investment of the commonplace. So it was just a superficial cliché. Now what is important too is the fact that far from the idea that frequently associated to communitarianism, that community construction are unanimous. While the grammar, as any other grammar, this last grammar, makes room for difference. And I will mention that with the last fieldwork. It has some connection, of course, with the notion of symbols, and I am thinking of the way Beckett is reinvesting in his very nice approach to value, both the idea of symbols and the idea of collective effervescence. Well, there is something of that in this grammar, but I would add that by contrast to Durkheim, there is attention paid in this grammar to the possibility of differing and the way people differ, which is not something, you know, that Durkheim was very clear about. Okay, the last paragraph is about what I said before, this social network issue. And now here are the third grammar compared with the previous one. And you see that the medium, which was this qualification for the common good in the first grammar of orders of worth, which was this publicly accessible options for choices, in the second one, is now this commonplace, but again, which have to be invested. Now, to end my talk, I will refer to field research. I participated in it, and the photos are mine, but the research is mainly Olga Koveneva, and published in French, in Russian, unfortunately not yet in English. It was part of this research originally entitled From Close to Public Binding Engagement, and now I will pay much more attention to common engagement and not only public. This was one of the findings of this research. And what was fascinating is that fieldwork in both countries, but I will only mention the Russian one, was a sort of small-scale model of the most wide-ranging and inclusive variety of evaluation models, which is exactly what I had in mind with this talk. So it appears to be a protected nature, open to everybody, classical park. On the left, you have one of the main activists, Chernov, to protect nature, while on the right, something of the wasted nature. And now you have this main threat, real estate against real nature, classical issues. But you have many more things than real estate. You have spiritual estate, which is also something which raises problem, because the church is transforming considerably the park, and even moving a cemetery to build a heater, a heating system. Yeah. Now, what is more important for my talk is the fact that there is a blessed nature, which is not the institutional religious faith. And here there is a holy source with people taking water and worshipping the source. But this is very important. The source, excuse me, the spring. The source is abstract. The spring, the keeper of the spring, is certainly not an Orthodox priest. He's just a Jewish guy who decided to keep the source. Which means that here we have this clear example of familiar concern for nature, which has nothing to do with the instituted church. Now there is a civic. You certainly, if you are from the West, you certainly ignore what is a civic ski lift. Well, it's a free ski lift, movable, which was built every year by labor union, Soviet labor union. Now there is a sort of relic of that, but there is also a new one, which is a profitable, paying new ski lift. So they have very clear civic and market equipment of this nature. You have this familiar and familiar enjoying. And now, this is interesting too, because you have both equipment should be forbidden in a protected area. You'll never see them in US protected spaces. On the left, it was built by the responsible, the director of the park, for the, she says, for the babushka, for the old, not necessarily very old, but mother, who need to rest. So this is interesting because it's a way to get closer to this familiar relation to nature. This closeness, which is completely ignored by a very, I would say, integrist conception of nature protection. On the right, it should be even more obscure for Western people, because it is a completely self-made area for shashlik, for, what is shashlik? What is? Barbecue. Well, it's not barbecue. It's very different from American barbecue, because you have just a fire and you bring your what is this?
Grilling.
Yeah.
Kebab?
Okay. Well, shashlik.
Brochette.
Brochette, yes, brochette in French, but in English.
Skewers. Skewers.
So, of course, it should be completely forbidden, because you are creating your fire yourself. But this is one of the celebration. This is the Russian form. If you work, as I do on Brazil, you'll have other form. You have no shashlik in Brazil. But within this grammar, which is very strong in the two countries, not the unique at all the grammars are used in Russia. But this grammar is strong here, and there is a very important moment, which is a celebration, a feast, where this commonality is very strong, but something more, where I would say all the differences, all the inequalities are put to zero during the feast, in a sort of reset, if I can put it in this horrible way, reset of common humanity. And I think this is very important for both political and moral issues. Well, now I'm close to the end. The left is completely pristine nature. Now the right, but you don't see anything of that. This is horrible. I'm sorry. It's good on our screen, and it's good. It's better in mine, and you don't see anything. Well, no use for bringing photos. But on the right, just to mention, this is a sort of personal garden, which was completely hidden within a part of the park. Example of design and personally accommodated playground. This is for mountain bike on the right. And this is the farthest from the natural preserve park, because it is Nestle Clear Energy Festival. And you can see that it is very far from enjoying pristine nature. Okay. Now, the conclusion is about the impact of this governing by standards on this extreme variety of evaluation modes and engagement that I mentioned in this small-scale model. And you can see the way these various engagements are oppressed by this reduction to standards, and even more, the most recent stage, I would say, of this governing by standard is governing by objectives in terms of plans, and objectives, which are supposed to be objectively measured. Something that I did not mention before about the category of engagement is the following. Just think of convention, which is more easy to think of. You have classically two views of convention. Conventional, two meanings. Conventional as arbitrary, non-authentic. So a critical view, which is the view that sociologists praise. And second, conventional in terms of agreement. People agree about a convention. And this is something Durkheim was interested in, but he was somewhat alone among sociologists. And this is the reason why we are also not only pragmatist influenced in terms of American pragmatism, but influenced by Durkheim, is the fact that, the French movement, is the fact that we pay much attention to this second phase of the convention, or first phase, sorry, the phase of the letter of the convention. which is of course praised by Lowe. Well, now, one of the problems of the governing by objectives is the fact that through a process of reduction that I've studied, that I will not unfold today, you only take into account the first phase of these two conventional dynamics, and even you reduce the first phase to a measurement, which is even somehow more reductive. Well, this is in short, this transparency. Now back to SSSR, and this is my last. There is a strange irony of fate in the story and history my talk ends with, in the Polytechnical Museum. It brings us back here, not to Bardi, to singers, but to the famous Soviet film Ironia Судьбы, which speaks of astonishing resemblance. And the resemblance in that case is very strange. It's a resemblance between Soviet times and our contemporary times. Of course, I don't want to ignore the differences, and the close KGB Lubyanka is reminding us of the differences. But let us think of what we call langue de bois in France, without, unfortunately, equivalence in English and not in Russian, and there should be equivalence in Russian, which is the control on conventional language. When you make language entirely conventional. Can't, maybe in English, would it be all right? Can't? Okay. Well, this is something which is the result of this governing by objectives. And the consequence is double language in both cases, Soviet and our cases. And we've seen the possibility of lying in Frank Dobbin's talk and recent exposition regarding the bank. But lies cannot be the end of the story, because they prevent coordination or create a double level of coordination. Schizoid madness, which was something very well studied by Soviet sociologists and Soviet citizens in general. And the consequence might be that the hidden real world revenges against words. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. Well, I've got just a question about this case that you had, just regarding all the grammars that you mentioned. For example, I turn just to know this place, for example, and if we try to analyze it using the grammars, say, actually, for example, a church seems to be like a common good, and this particular building was built in the 17th century, so it is also like a historical thing. Say, religiously it would have been like interest-spreading or grammar, but on the other hand, like part of, I don't know, like common goods, if taken in that account. So could you maybe elaborate, say, what do these like grammars help us or explain just for us as researchers?
Part of my talk with this shots was very quick, so it's not the analysis. The analysis is done in the articles, and there is a need to go deep in the way this different equipment of the world can be engaged. So you are right, the church in itself is not just something that you can attribute simply to one way of engaging. And we work from the observation, and not only from linguistic records, but also from observation, and this is especially needed when we go down at this level of familiarity, because language is not very adequate to express this familiarity engagement. So one needs to observe, to video, to take shots, and also to talk to people, to have an idea of the way they make valuable this kind of engagement, for instance, with the spring. It would be a better example than the church, because of the church is quite institutionalized here. But the spring is both connected with the church, but also connected with a wide variety of other engagement, which create tensions between them, which can be brought together, but which create tension. The tool, it's not a tool of classification. It's a tool of clarification of the art of composition that human beings have to develop. So it's a tool to get further than the notion of practice in the way people engage with the world and place value on their relation to the world, you see? So, of course, I could go on with the demonstration about what we observed around the spring. And as I said, let's say the church. Well, the Pope was highly criticized by the activists because of the way he had individual interest in developing his church. Okay. Now you say, okay, the activist is classically opposed to religion. Now, I ask him very bluntly and stupidly, as foreign people can do, This is a very useful utilization of foreign situation. So I asked him, but are you a believer? And he said, of course I am a believer. I would have never done what I've done as civic activism without that. Though he's a believer, but he's very critical about some kind of engagement of the church by the Pope. So you see, this is not rigid attribution of an equipment to an engagement. No, it is a tool to see the dynamics in the way people can relate to the world and relate to others through this engagement.
Tell us how you think, how you would compare your conception of grammars to your own conception of justification, to Goffman's frames, and to institutional logics, as it gets used a lot in the American literature now. So I'm curious about whether you think these concepts are doing very different things, or whether you think they're doing kind of similar things in different paradigms.
I will not answer the second one, because there will be next year workshop entirely dedicated to that, with author involved. I don't see the person who is responsible for that. She's, yes, here, so you can say a few words about that. But regarding the first, Goffman, first, Goffman is an extraordinary sociologist and very important for what we do, so no question about that. Now, as you know, first, Goffman has not an explicit conception of politics. He has an implicit one, because he is very concerned by the requirement of the public space in a very original way, if you think of a discursive public space. And he, in some also pieces of him, he has very nice insights about, well, actually what I would call familiarity. You remember the mental patient has a small package of observed things for any observer. And this is his, the last result of the reduction of his familiar space. And he goes with it anywhere. So he has very nice insights about that. But he does not develop the problem, the complete problem of this making common, this kind of personal attachment to the world. Second, I would say something more precise. Although he has, as you know, different resources. One of them is ethology, and actually ethology is very influenced by human politics, but it's supposed not to be. He has ethology, but he has something which creates a bias in his analysis of politics. Again, very nice practical analysis of behavior. He is deeply influenced by the liberal grammar. Individuals, strategies, options, and he doesn't really care for these issues of common goods, which were dealt with by this grammar of orders of worth. And he would certainly not care for what the third grammar captures, you see, which is a kind of commonality through these commonplaces, not through discursive language, but not through presentation of the individual self in public. This is not at all the stake of the third grammar.
How can you verify that what you have found is somehow objective, or at least detached? It's not a person. It's not about. It's about this methodology. That if we deal with interpretations, how can we know that our interpretation is the right one?
Well, in that case, we go on to answer your question to what we do with field work. I just mentioned through the shop. We work on tensions, passions. This is, by the way, something that's familiar to ethnomethodology and to Goffman also. His gène, qu'est-ce que c'est déjà en anglais, le gène chez Goffman? Uneasiness, something like that. So, this is the way we have the relation, a very strong relation to the empirical observation, because we can observe this tension, uneasiness, and then we work on the way the people realize the test of this engagement of them. I mean by that, how are they putting, and again, this is not an issue of language only, how are they putting to the test of their experience the kind of engagement in which they are. And this is the way we can interpret, if you want, or recognize one engagement from the other. This is through the tension that the people who observe reveal through this test of reality. At the level of public debate, the classical issue of controversies in actual network theory. But we go at other levels of uneasiness. But these others are also observable in terms of gestures, in terms of, yes, uneasiness can be observed. Otherwise, we have nothing to observe, of course. The valuation in itself cannot be observed.
I guess the question is, trying to get you to so in the book you were saying how managers were trying to remove any kind of personal attachments in their justification in order to be objective. And today, talking about regimes of engagement, I've heard you advocating personal attachment as good to bring it to. So can you compare and contrast?
These pieces of research, which are each of these pieces of research dedicated to a different problem. And it's as if you were taking them as my opinion of the world. Well, this is not the problem. In On Justification, it was already explicit in the book, we were concerned by the kind of criticism and justification which refer to the common good. That doesn't mean that the common good is really involved, but which try to refer to the common good. And this is the main issue for power, because of course these are inequality of power, and a way to maintain the inequality of power is to make them, as Weber explained to us, and one of these ways is to relate them to, okay, this is not what I think of the manager. It is one way to analyze a part of the activities of the managers. Well, now I develop further, of course, the theory. This is I'm paid for that. And what I say today is not another view about what the managers are. It is an extension of the model so that we can see other moments of the life of the people and the effect of some managing technique, for instance, which is what I call governing by the objective. So, to see the effect, we need to have a broader model. But this is not a change in my view of the world, you know. But in On Justification, that's clear, we had no understanding of this familiarity valuation, because we looked at the world deliberately from the public, which means generalization. And for this view, from this view, familiar is peculiar, as I said, from the research. But actually the familiar is not peculiar at all for your life. It's something completely crucial for your life.